Dr. Sean Utsi is a professor of psychology and chair of the African American Studies Department at Virginia Commonwealth University. He is a graduate of North Carolina A&T University and received his PhD in counseling psychology from Fordham University in New York City. Dr. Utsi research interests are primarily in two areas, both of which are related to the psychology of the African American. His primary interest is in understanding how race-related stress impacts the psychological, physiological, and social well-being of African Americans. His other area of interest is in the influence of culture on the health and well-being of African Americans. In addition to his academic research interests, Dr. Utsi has directed and produced 3 full-length documentary films. These include Meet Me in the Bottom, The Struggle to Reclaim Richmond's African Burial Ground, Until the Well Runs Dry, Medicine and the Exploitation of Black Bodies, and Toward a Black Psychology, Origin and Evolution of a Discipline. He is currently working on a film about the Central State Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane, the first psychiatric hospital in the world exclusively for the treatment of African Americans with mental illness. Please take a moment to welcome our speaker, Dr. Utsi.
All right, good morning. Morehouse, what's up? Good, good, good. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm hoping that today I can share something that might resonate with you, that you might find useful in your travels through the academic and professional lives that you are about to embark upon. I have planned to share a snippet from my documentary film, but we're having some technical difficulties, so I'll go on with my discussion around the topic. Today's topic is called A White Lie, the cultural hegemony of Western psychology. I actually had the privilege of chatting with a group of very bright young men this morning in the psychology class of the African American experience. And we were discussing how to navigate racism in society. And the point I was making with them was that racism is a distraction. Although it's real, racism is like playing checkers when we should be playing chess. Today, I want to open up to you the chessboard so we can understand how white supremacy has shaped the narrative by which we view African American behavior. Now, it's important to understand how influential psychology is on our everyday lives. Much of the work of Sigmund Freud, who's probably the most famous psychologist that people know about, but we don't realize how much Sigmund Freud's scholarship has shaped the way we see everyday life. And it has. But the important thing to know about that is that Sigmund Freud's narrative had nothing to do with the black experience. And any time you began to evaluate the behavior of black folks from a lens that was intended to evaluate somebody else, black folk are always going to be seen as problematic or abnormal. So I want to today open up the discussion about how to understand the behavior of black folks. Can you turn the light back on? Because I can't see nobody. I'm from New York, so you gotta keep your eye on everybody all the times. Can you turn the light back on? Thank you, because I'm squinting with the light in my eyes like that. Thank you. Can we move the slide? Okay. I want to share with you a statement that was made by John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun was the Secretary of State. He was the Secretary of State in the mid-1800s. He said that the African is incapable of self-care and sinks into lunacy under the burden of freedom. It is a mercy to give him the guardianship and protection from mental death. He was trying to justify slavery. But John C. Calhoun was not a redneck Klansman living in the mountains of Tennessee or somewhere. He was the Secretary of State for the United States of America. And his belief that black people could not manage themselves in freedom was held widely in the South. And in fact, it was used for an argument to extend slavery in the Western territories and to maintain slavery even during the end of the Civil War. And the importance here is that we understand how this thinking, which is described generally as scientific racism, begins to permeate how the discipline of psychology understands people, and particularly black people. So the idea that black folks cannot take care of themselves, that we prefer to be enslaved because the burden of freedom was too much to manage, is something that was widely held by not only John C. Calhoun, but other psychologists. Next slide. I want to talk about culture because the title suggests that the cultural hegemony, meaning the cultural imposition, imposing an alien culture on a people, is going to result in some negative consequences. But before we can do that, let's talk about what culture is. What is culture? Culture is a vast structure of behaviors, of ideas, of beliefs, attitudes, values, of customs, language, rituals, ceremonies, and practices that are peculiar to a particular people that gives them a general design for living. Everything we understand about the world, we understand through a cultural lens. Culture informs how we interact with others. Culture informs how we engage in relationships, whether they be romantic or family, how we engage people in the street. The decisions we make about occupations, about careers, is informed by culture. For example, I know right now there's a big discussion about the STEM field and why black folks don't go into the STEM field. Why aren't there many blacks in physics and chemistry and biology and such? First of all, it's not really true. But we have been conditioned to react to that kind of criticism as somehow saying that black people aren't smart enough, when there are other reasons why black folks tend to be attracted towards certain disciplines. For example, in my experience, black folks are heavily concentrated in social work, education, nursing, teaching, psychology, and in fields in which there is an opportunity to help other people. The whole worldview in the black experience is really not been centered on trying to advance one's individual self, but trying to advance the collective, taking care of others, sometimes to a fault. So there are other reasons why you might find the career decisions that black folks made are driven by cultural choices, not really restrictions or the inability to perform in sciences. The next slide. Here are some important concepts that you should be aware of in terms of how we know what we know. Now in psychology, the idea is if you can't see it, if you can't observe it, and you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Have you heard that before? This is kind of the scientific measure. If you can't, scientific method, if you can't observe it, and you can't measure it, and you can't replicate it, the phenomena doesn't exist. Now, unfortunately, in the black experience, there are things that are the essence of black folk that can't be measured. For example, this morning we were talking about soul, right? The idea that we may talk about some singers, like the Godfather soul. Who's the Godfather soul? James Brown. Who's the Queen of soul? All right. And what is Mary J. Blige? She's the what? She's the queen of hip hop and soul, right? What about Beyonce? What is she? You see? We recognize that perhaps Beyonce is attractive and she can sing, but it's not soul that describes what she brings, right? And if I ask you to tell me, why is Mary J. Blige have soul and Beyonce doesn't really have the same kind of soul she has? You probably couldn't describe it, but you feel it, right? The idea is when you're talking to your partner and you say, yo, I feel you. He's saying that I hear what you're saying, but I feel you in my heart. I understand you, right? And the idea is that African people of African descent, we see and understand with our hearts. And in psychology, you perhaps can't measure that. You can't measure soul. When people were excited about President Obama becoming president, they talked about how he behaved, how he walked. He had swag. Is it swag? What is it now? Grip. He had grip. Okay. Is that drip? Oh, okay. So he had drip, right? But what it is is something that you can see in him that lets you know that he's connected to you, right? It's something that tells you he's with me. He's a part of me. He's like me. You can't describe it, but when you see it, you know it. And these are phenomena that are important to African descent people that if you are a psychologist, you will not be able to study because you don't have the tools. You can't observe it, you can't measure it, and you can't replicate it. It can't be taught, right? So ontology is the branch of metaphysics that studies the nature of existence. How do things exist? How do you know they exist? What exists? For example, when somebody dies in our family, sometimes even on Thanksgiving, we'll set a plate for them, right? We might even report to others in the family that Nana is here, Nana or Big Mama is here with me. I can feel her presence, right? She speaks to me. She came to me in a dream. These are things that reflect the experiences, the lived experiences of black folks that psychology is not prepared or willing to consider as part of the phenomenon. So what happens is the behaviors of black folks are understood from the lens of non-black folks. And your behavior is evaluated in terms of whether it's normal or abnormal from that same lens. So not only is psychology derelict in its duty to accurately report or accurately describe behavior, it also pathologizes behavior that it doesn't understand. And this is important. Cosmology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the origins and structure of the universe. African people, by extension African American people, understand that everything in the universe is interconnected. When people say I am because you are, and because you are, therefore I am, it means that what happens to you happens to me, right? This is why when you watch a film of another black man being shot by the police or someone being harassed or harmed, you are feeling the pain that that person feels because you realize that's happening to you, right? That's happening to you. And this reflects the cosmology of African people, that you are connected to something much greater than you, right? And even when I was a young kid and I would bring home a friend my mother didn't know, right? She would say, "Who's that?" I said, "That's Freddie Johnson." "Oh, he one of them Johnson boys." She would reference him by his last name because she knew the family and she would make a judgment about him based on the behavior and character of his family. So if the Johnsons were some trifling people, I couldn't hang out with Freddie no more because she wanted to know who is his family, right? So the idea that I am an extension of my family is an African concept. I'm not Sean Yutsi. What Sean Yutsi does to either advance or limit myself is not really important. How I respect, how I represent my name, my family, and my community to the public is important. So I can't go out in the street and embarrass somebody. You know what happens if you embarrass your mom in the street, right? We talked about that this morning as well. Axiology, but let me come down to epistemology real quickly. Epistemology investigates the origin and nature and methods and limits of human knowledge. How do we know what we know? As I said earlier, what we can see, what we can measure, what we can replicate is what we know. I submit to you that that concept is a Western concept that disadvantages black people in the context of psychology and probably a lot of other fields where they rely on this method. Next slide. Ethos. Ethos is also another important term because it speaks to the character or spirit of a culture. What is the culture ethos? If I asked you to describe African American culture, what would you say? Many people, and I've done this in the class as an experiment, many people will talk about some of the stereotypes of black people as cultural framing. They might say black people are loud, right? Black people are passionate, or black people are angry. And those are the surface descriptions of black behavior through the lens of other people that we've internalized to understand our own behavior, right? Black people are late to events. Black people are this. Black people are emotional, right? Those are behaviors that have been observed by others and interpreted from an alien frame of reference. When you look at the behaviors closely, right, and understand that black folks relate to time differently than other folks. All right, so it's not CP time. It means that black folks are in time as opposed to on time. The example I gave this morning, again, dating myself, and even this reference is probably a little after, but I was talking about how Jay-Z talks about after the concert is the hotel lobby. I mean the after party, right? Messed that up. After the after party is the hotel lobby. The idea is that the party doesn't begin and end at some time. It changes, it relocates, it evolves into something else. Even when I was a kid, we had basement parties and house parties, and you get an invite in school. It would usually say 9 p.m. until. That's what the party invite said, until. It didn't say 2 a.m. or 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. It said until. Because the idea was that the party would kind of take on a life of its own. That black folks would be in time and they would do their thing until they didn't like doing it no more. The other example I gave was when your grandmother tells you she's coming by. Or you ask grandma, what time you coming by? She says, I'll be by after a while. Or I'll be by directly. Meaning that when she gets there, she'll be there. And people accept that as an answer. So the way that black folks relate to time is not necessarily abnormal. It's not a reflection of being lazy or just being irresponsible. It's a different relationship to time. But in all reality, when you are functioning in an alien culture, their rules trump your rules, particularly if it's a dominant culture. So being in time becomes dysfunctional when you are dealing with an alien time orientation. So the important thing to understand is that it's not abnormal, it's just different. Next slide. Okay, here's where I really want to spend some time. Scientific racism. Where did that come from and what is it? Scientific racism is how we codify the beliefs about black people being inferior. Right? It's not just racism. If it was just racism and someone called you in a name, we could deal with that. But scientific racism has found its way into the academic circles that we rely on to inform us about the lived experience. Everything we know about people, we typically learn from textbooks, or others who learn from textbooks tell us about people, right? We have to ferret out the racism that is inherent in those systems to understand who we really are. Now, scientific racism is predicated upon the emergence of a rigid class structure in Britain, science on the rise vis-a-vis religion, and a growing anti-slavery movement in the US. Next slide. Eugenics and psychology. Eugenics is a movement that began in Europe, in Britain, that was an attempt to create a society that had mostly smart people, people who they believed were worthy of living. So in Britain, they wanted to figure out, Sir Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin, was trying to figure out how can they regulate who can have children and who can't have children. So eugenics was trying to find a system that controlled or regulated the ability to procreate. And only smart people or people of a certain ethnic background could have children. At first, it had nothing to do with black people. It was Europeans trying to figure out which Europeans were more desirable than others. As we know, Southern Europeans, the Italians and Spanish, have some African admixture as a consequence of the North African incursions into Southern Europe. And so they were seen as less desirable than the Nordic Europeans. They were seen as the most elite or intelligent group of people. And so it was believed that they are the ones who should be able to procreate and to create a society that has people like them. So in England, they began to use IQ testing, right, as a way to figure out who should be able to have children. And IQ testing became really a curse for black people. Next slide. But we have to first understand how racism began to creep into the religious orientation of the West, meaning Europe and the United States. The Judeo-Christian perspectives on people informs us how racism was part of that early narrative. Because in the early days, psychology, which is really interpreted as study of the soul. Psyche is Greek for soul. So psychology is really the study of the soul. It's more lately become behavior and observing behavior, but originally it was a study of the soul. So religion was an important part of understanding humans and what made humans tick. But the Christian era brought us Genesis, the curse of Ham. Do we know about the curse of Ham? The curse of Ham has to do with the story of Noah and Noah's Ark, right? And so the story is told in different scriptures in different ways. So in the curse of Ham is also told in the Babylonian Talmud, which was the oral tradition of Judaism. But in the Talmud, it suggests that Ham was cursed for having sex on the ark. The Book of Mormon, in Nephi 5:21, it says that dark-skinned individuals are the result of a curse being placed against a rebellious leader named Laman. So different scriptures, different religious texts have different interpretations on Ham and why Ham was cursed. Next slide. But here's a Christian story in the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, there was some shenanigans and tomfoolery going on in the ark. We know that, right? Here's the direct quote from Genesis 9:24-27. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him. His youngest son was Ham. Okay? So, and he said, cursed be Canaan. Canaan is Ham's son. Canaan, Cush, Put, and Mizraim are Ham's children. Right? Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. 27, God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall have dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servants. Okay, this is not me making this up. This is straight from the King James text, right? Now, we know that Cush is Nubia. Cush is what is today modern day Sudan, Ethiopia. That's the ancient land of Cush. All right, next slide. Let's look at the map for the dispersion of Ham's descendants. You see Ham's descendants. Those are African people, right? Now who was cursed? Ham's people was cursed. Who were the ones that were blessed? Japheth. That's Europe. Now already, out the gate, I'm suspicious of the Bible that sets up a scenario whereby black people are inferior and Europeans are somehow superior. So this notion of the superiority of one group and the inferiority of black people is not a new notion. It didn't just come out of slavery, right? It didn't come out of slavery. It was already being set up in the religious scriptures of the times. Next slide. So we begin with a country that was steeped in a Judeo-Christian perspective. And many times they would use the story of Ham to justify slavery. That it wasn't on us. God is the one that cursed y'all and told us, the descendants of Japheth, that you would be our servants, the descendants of Ham. So don't be mad at me, be mad at God. Was how the narrative went in the antebellum South, when whites were trying to justify slavery. And later they would use the same science, or pseudoscience, to justify the inferiority of African people. Now, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, who's heard of Samuel Cartwright? Okay, Dr. Samuel Cartwright was a physician in Louisiana during slavery, right? He was kind of the expert on African people, meaning African Americans or enslaved Africans. And he was called upon to figure out what was going on with black people and why were they always running away? Or why weren't they working harder? So Samuel Cartwright came up with a diagnosis. Now these are the first recorded diagnoses of any type. Right now we have a book about this big called the DSM-5, and maybe 6 out now, that tells us when people are struggling with psychiatric illnesses, what they're having. So we go in the book, we figure out it's major depression, or it's bipolar disorder, or whatever. Cartwright came up with 2 diagnoses for black people. The first one was called drapetomania. Drapetomania literally meant the flight from home madness. And so he believed that enslaved people who ran away were actually mentally ill. Now how could he arrive at that? He wasn't simply being racist, The worldview of Europeans or white Americans at that time was that black people were actually happy in slavery. That slavery was a benefit to black people and that they were happy. How do we know? Because they're always dancing and singing, right? And so for them to run away means something is wrong with them. And so he had a diagnosis, drapetomania. The second diagnosis he called dysanthesia ethiopica. Now Ethiopia is referencing Ethiopia, the country in Africa, or the region at the time. It wasn't just the country, it was the whole region of Kush, right? That historians refer to. So he's saying that this is a disease specific to black people. It was called rascality by local people. And it was an insensibility of nerves and hermitude of mind. They believed that the black people who were enslaved, who were trying to fight their slavery by not doing work, working slow, killing the chickens, poisoning the cows, breaking the farm equipment, they were resisting their slavery. He believed that they were crazy too. Again, the idea was that people are happy in slavery and therefore running away or not doing their work properly was mental illness. Next slide. Now, as we moved on into the 19th century, psychology and racism became more sophisticated. So we had Francis Galton. He was the founder of the eugenics movement. We talked about him already. We had Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer coined the term survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is a Darwinian term that suggests that people, animals, those who are strong, who are smart and physically strong, will find a way to survive. Those who are not will die off. This becomes a foundation to explain the inferiority of black people. That somehow helping black people with affirmative action, with other kinds of programs, is really going against the natural selection process. G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall is the father of American psychology. One of the most eminent psychologists in the United States, and the co-founder of the American Psychological Association. He believed that blacks and Asians were all part of an adolescent race, that they weren't as evolved as white folks. Then we had Gustave Le Bon. He said the races of man are psychologically and physically distinct, and Arthur Jensen, who would become one of the most important architects of eugenics or scientific racism. He says that the inferiority of African Americans is not because they're poor or because they're living in ghettos. It's because they are genetically inferior, that their genes don't allow them to progress. Next slide. G. Stanley Hall, that I mentioned earlier, said that every child from conception to maturity recapitulates every stage of development and must be treated gently and understandably by more developed peoples. We're talking about black people. In his widely read work, Adolescence, Hall describes Africans, Indians, and Chinese as members of adolescent races in a stage of incomplete growth. Next slide. Carl Jung. Carl Jung is a psychologist who spent a lot of time in Africa studying the unconscious mind, or the collective mind, or the collective unconscious is what he called it. He thought of himself as an expert on black people because of the time he spent in Africa. Many beliefs mirrored stereotypes of American contemporaries. He believed that a different strata of mind corresponds to the history of races. The Negro has probably a whole historical layer less than that of the white man is what Carl Jung said. So the idea that these prominent psychologists actually had quite racist views about black people and that they were so influential in their work on the field should be of concern to us. Next slide. Now, here's where things got really, really sticky. The whole concept of IQ. IQ became a concept, an instrument, if you will, that codified the inferiority of black people. Now there was a way to use empirical evidence to have numbers, and we know that numbers don't lie. Numbers do lie, but we've been told they don't lie, and we repeat that. But the idea that numbers can now prove that black folks are inferior has upped the game. Next slide. This is a bell curve. The bell curve describes most phenomena, all phenomena in existence. Everything in the universe can be ascribed to a bell curve. For example, most people on any measure are going to fall in the middle, right? Some people will be on the edges. If we go for shoe size, say the average shoe size is a size 8. Most people will wear between a size 6 and a size 9. Most people on the planet, right? If we did height, and the average height was 5 foot, 6 foot, most people are going to be between 5'5" and 6'5", right? Those are the rules of nature. They began to talk about IQ, intelligence, in the context of most people are going to be average, right? Then you have people who fall on the outsides, either very smart or not too smart. Next slide. Now, here are the basics in the IQ debate. The average IQ of white folks is said to be 100. The average IQ of black folks is said to be 85. The average IQ of Africans from Africa is said to be 70. Now 70 is technically mentally retarded. Technically 70 is mentally retarded. They explain the advantage of black Americans of 15 points over Africans. How? Guess how they explain that? They say that the white admixture of African Americans gives us a 15-point advantage over Africans. And that's why it's called the mulatto hypothesis. And so this is the belief system that whites have, on average, an IQ of 100. The average black IQ is 85, and Africans are mentally retarded. This is how they see the world, not 100 years ago, today. If you were in a graduate program in psychology, you would be learning this in intelligence testing. Next slide. Here is the distribution. Again, the average IQ is 100. The black distribution, you can see the average or the peak is at 85. The peak for the white distribution is at 100. Interestingly, Asians have an average IQ of 106, they say. Now, it doesn't mean that black folks aren't smart, according to them. You can see that even down here in 140 and 130, 120, there are still black folks falling, but not as many. And the most important thing is on average, right? Because folks are always going to say, of course, you're different. You're an exception. You're not like the others. But on average, the perception of black folks is that black folks are not as intelligent as everyone else, and that is not a consequence of culture, it's a consequence of genetics. Very dangerous, very dangerous. Now, here's the problem we have with IQ testing. Next slide. Here are the behaviors that are associated with high IQ and low IQ. Think about it. They say that the behaviors of people with low IQs is child abuse, neglect, poverty, unemployment, welfare, crime, idleness, high birth rates, single parenthood, poor health. These are all descriptions that society has of black people. Right? The funny thing is that society had these descriptions of black people long before there were IQ tests. Right? And you can see on the other side, for people who are smart, all the good things fall. So this is why it's important. Next slide. Now, the IQ game got real serious when you see that Hans Eisdick, who left Germany, he didn't want to join the Nazi party, so he left Germany and came to the US. And when he got here, as soon as he got here, he began to talk about racial differences in IQ and how blacks were inferior. Lewis Terman, IQ tests prove that low-level intelligence common in Spanish, Indian, Mexican, and Negroes. No amount of school instruction will ever make them intelligent voters or capable citizens in the true sense. So IQ began to take on real practical meaning. It began to influence policy. Next slide. Now, the real dangerous person was Arthur Jensen. Arthur Jensen talked about IQ differences cannot be overcome with early childhood experiences. He was arguing against Head Start. The government was saying, let's pour money into Head Start to make the playing field level. The fact that black children coming from poverty don't have exposure to early childhood stimulation. Let's include Head Start to make the playing field level. Arthur Jensen was saying, don't waste your money, because the differences is not environmental, it's genetic. A very dangerous argument. Next slide. Robert Yerkes, he was the person who developed the first widely administered test, the Army Alpha Beta test. This was a test that they gave to soldiers in World War I to figure out where they would be assigned for jobs. This was also an important development in the IQ testing game. Next slide. Now, I was talking to you earlier about the whole idea of skin complexion. Here's an article by Richard Lynn. Richard Lynn is also an architect of the scientific racism movement. He talked about skin color and intelligence in African Americans. He wasn't talking about African Americans and whites. He was talking about in African Americans. He was arguing and trying to show that the relationship between skin color and intelligence was examined in 430 African American adults. They found a significant positive correlation of 1.7, which is very small. Folks, if you do research, you know that's tiny. It's tiny. The only reason it was significant was because of the large sample size. But anyway, he's saying it's proposed that the result supports the hypothesis that the level of intelligence in African Americans is significantly determined by the proportion of Caucasian genes. Right? This is what folks believe. Next slide. Here's another study. This study. Look at the date on this study. 2012. 2012, folks. Do pigmentation and melanocortin system modulate aggression and sexuality in humans as they do in other animals? This is trying to say, are black people as animalistic as apes and chimpanzees when it comes to sex and aggression? This is a nice way of saying this in a journal, so it doesn't sound overtly racist. But when you read the results and what they did, the whole out of Africa model suggests that white people are intellectually superior because they left Africa earlier and they encountered a cold climate that was more unforgiving, and that in order to survive in a cold climate, you had to be smarter. They believed that coconuts were falling off the trees in Africa, and so Africans didn't have to do anything to survive. Whereas white folks who were living in glacial ice ages had to be creative and resourceful to survive. Now there's a theory by Sheikh Anta Diop called the three cradle theory of civilization. Michael Bradley, who wrote a book called The Iceman Inheritance, they talk about this out of Africa theory differently in terms of how we behave toward other people and why racism exists. And Michael Bradley says that this whole cold climate where you go for self and kill anybody who gets in your way is what conditioned Europeans to behave as they've been behaving toward African people and Native people historically. Next slide. This one trips me out. An examination of Rushton's theory of difference in penis length and circumference in the archaic life history theory in 113 populations. Folks, these fools are measuring people's penises to make the argument that black people are less intelligent. And you can tell by the big penises. This is what they're saying. This is not me making it up. You see it for yourself. Look at the date, 2012. 2012. This is not a long time ago. This is, I don't know who was measuring, but that's nasty. Right? The new data extend Russian's theory by presenting disaggregated data for penis size for European, North African, South Asian, Caucasoids. Right? Then they got Southeast Mongolians, Inuit, Armenians, Mestizos. Wow! They were going around the world asking people to show them their penises.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And they find a place to publish this. This journal is not a small journal. This is a pretty significant journal. Right? But these are the people. Rushton, Richard Lynn, who have dedicated their lives to trying to understand and prove the inferiority of black people. So even this idea that secondary sex characteristics, that's what penis is, a secondary sex characteristics. They're saying that black people are so dumb that if they're not reminded to procreate, they'll forget. So for example, when women have exaggerated secondary sex characteristics like breasts and butt, hips, they're saying that those women are less intelligent than women who have ironing board behinds or no shape at all. I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. The idea that the less you have means the more intelligent you are, because the people who are not so smart, they have to be reminded to have sex, otherwise they won't procreate and have more kids, and eventually they'll be extinct. This is what the theory suggests. Next slide. But folks, let me begin to wrap up by saying that racism has become a much kinder and gentler endeavor. Psychologists have taken notes on how to tone it down a little bit. So now we have cultural racism. Cultural racism suggests that black people, through no fault of their own, are inferior because they have disadvantaged environments. That the exaggerated American whose culture is merely distorted development of the pathology condition of American culture. That the Negro is only an American and nothing else. He has no values and no culture to guard and protect. That the Negro has, technically speaking, no culture of his own. The idea that black people are simply in limbo. That we don't have culture. And that's a function of the chaos results from us not having any culture. Remember, culture is a framework for living. And the absence of culture means you have no framework for living, so it's chaotic. This is the perspective that psychology has now about black people. Next slide. Cardina and Oversee wrote an important book called The Mark of Oppression. The Mark of Oppression, they said that the black personality is viewed as a sum total of oppression experienced in America. So if it wasn't for racism and slavery, black folks would not have a personality to speak of. So everything you are and everything you become is a consequence of slavery and racism. This is how they began to view the black personality. Next slide, please. Again, they began to talk about self-esteem. Notice that in psychology, the narrative for black people is self-esteem. There's always a focus on self-esteem. Black folks have low self-esteem. If you do this, it increases self-esteem. This whole narrative, again, is based on some assumptions that are not good. The first assumption is that black people have a conviction of unlovability, that we're not worthy of love. The second is that there's a restricted affectivity. We don't feel pain. We don't feel happiness. We have uncontrolled hostility, that we are angry black men and women. And so this becomes a narrative in which the perspective of black behavior is shaped. And there's a tendency for us, even when we go into academia and become psychologists, sociologists, that we simply pick up where others left off. And we begin to mimic the same ideas about black behavior. So I would caution you that when you were in graduate school, or you're teaching, make sure you locate your own narrative. Reject the narrative that black people are inferior, either genetically or culturally. Locate your narrative. Discover where we understand the behavior of black folks from a design that makes sense for black folks. All right? I think my time is up, folks, but I want to thank you for engaging me. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Gentlemen, before we move, we are standing in a different spot. Do not move. We are going to stand differently. The scanners are going to get in their place first. I promise you this will be much more efficient if you follow my instructions. Now, before we move, we're going to sing the hymn. Thank you. Adrian, if you would, get in the chair for me. Get inside of us. And I need to add as well, if you're going to be scanning, going out the side door, going behind the scanner here, he's going to scan you last. So it may be more efficient for you just to make a line in the aisle. Okay? Let's do this quickly as possible. I want you out in 5 minutes. Let's sing the hymn. Let's lock up.